every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The quiet of an autumn evening is a fragile thing. It's a gentle exhale at the end of a long day, a familiar comfort woven from the hum of traffic, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves skittering across pavement. On the 1st of October 2002, in Montgomery County, Maryland, that quiet was settling in, as it always did. The air was crisp, carrying the first real hint of the coming cold. People were locking up their shops, heading home from work, thinking about dinner. It was a landscape of profound and reassuring normalcy. This particular autumn carried a heavier weight, however. The nation was still living in the long shadow of the previous year's attacks. A low-grade, ambient anxiety had become part of the new normal. Fear had a specific shape then. Hijacked planes, anthrax in the mail. It was a fear of the grand, symbolic gesture. No one was prepared for a new kind of terror, one that was intimate, random, and terrifyingly mundane. But normalcy is an illusion, a collective agreement that the world will behave today as it did yesterday, and sometimes that agreement is broken by the sharp, singular crack of a rifle. That evening, a single .223 caliber bullet tore through the front window of a Michael's craft store in Aspen Hill. It shattered the glass, punched a neat hole through a decorative wreath, and lodged itself in a shelf at the back of the store. No one was hurt. It was strange, certainly. Police chalked it up to a random act of vandalism, a stray shot from a reckless hunter, perhaps. There was no way to know that it wasn't an ending, but a prelude. It was the sound of a finely tuned instrument being tested before the performance. It was the first quiet note in a symphony of terror that would soon consume a nation's capital. 24 hours later, the performance began in earnest. The sun rose on Wednesday, October 2nd, another perfectly ordinary day. At 5:20 p.m., as the evening rush hour was beginning to swell, a 55-year-old computer analyst named James D. Martin was walking across the parking lot of a Shoppers Food Warehouse in Wheaton, Maryland. He was a program manager for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a father, a mentor to local students. He had just bought groceries for a church youth group meeting. A single shot rang out from a wooded area across the street, and he fell to the ground, killed instantly. An hour later, at 6:04 p.m., in a different part of Montgomery County, 50-year-old James Sonny Buchanan, Jr., a landscaper, was mowing a lawn near a car dealership. Buchanan was a family man, known for his work ethic and his kindness. Again, a single shot. Again, a man's life extinguished in the middle of a mundane task. The sun had not yet set, and the quiet machinery of death was just beginning its work. Over the next 23 days, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, a region encompassing parts of Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, would become a hunting ground. An invisible, ghost-like predator stalked its sprawling suburbs, turning the most innocuous of places, gas stations, schoolyards, parking lots, into kill zones. The weapon of choice was a high-velocity rifle fired from a distance, with chilling precision. The victims appeared to be chosen at random, their only commonality being their vulnerability in open spaces. A part-time taxi driver, a young mother, a government analyst, a landscaper, a retired carpenter, men and women, young and old, of all races and backgrounds. This utter lack of a discernible pattern was the core of the terror. If anyone could be a target, then everyone was a target. The social contract that allows us to move freely through the world, assuming a baseline of safety, was shredded. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of public terror. We will explore how two individuals, armed with a rifle and a carefully modified sedan, were able to paralyze a region of millions, elude one of the largest manhunts in American history, and embed a unique and lasting fear into the national psyche. We will piece together the psychological architecture of the killers, the twisted Svengali-Like relationship between a bitter, disenfranchised man and his impressionable surrogate son. We will examine the intricate, often frustrating multi-agency investigation as it raced against a mounting death toll, and we will analyze how the Beltway snipers, as they came to be known, masterfully manipulated fear itself, using the randomness of their violence as their most potent weapon. This is the story of John Allen Muhammad, Lee Boyd Malvo, and the 23 days they held a nation's capital in a state of siege. The morning of October 3rd was when the creeping unease began to curdle into outright fear. The two murders the previous evening were alarming, but they hadn't yet been publicly linked in the media. They were just two separate, tragic dots on a vast map, but the shooter or shooters were not finished. At 7:41 a.m., a 54-year-old part-time taxi driver named Premkumar Walekar was pumping gas at a mobile station in Aspen Hill, Maryland. He was a husband and father of two who had immigrated from India years earlier. A single shot, and he was dead. Less than an hour later, at 8:12 a.m., 39-year-old Sarah Ramos, a babysitter and housekeeper from El Salvador, was waiting for a bus, sitting on a bench outside a post office in Silver Spring. She had just gotten off another bus and was reading a book. She was killed where she sat 25 minutes after that, at 8:37 a.m. 25-year-old Lori Ann Lewis Rivera was vacuuming her red Dodge Caravan at a Shell station in Kensington. She was a young nanny, a vibrant presence in the lives of the children she cared for. A single bullet ended her life. The geographic clustering was tight. The shooter then got back on the highway and headed south. By 9:58 p.m. that same night, 72-year-old Pascal Charlotte, a retired carpenter who had moved to the U.S. from Haiti, was standing on a street corner in Washington, D.C. He was shot and killed. The sniper had now crossed state lines into the district itself. By mid-morning on October 3rd, a horrifying realization was dawning on law enforcement. The shell casings recovered from each scene in Maryland were all the same, .223 caliber, fired from the same rifle. Ballistics experts at the ATF lab confirmed the link. 5 people had been murdered in Montgomery County in less than 16 hours by the same unseen assailant. The news exploded across local and national media. Montgomery County Police Chief Charles Moose, a stoic and imposing figure who would become the public face of the investigation, held a press conference. His words were measured, but the gravity of the situation was unmistakable. He spoke of a geographic nexus of evil and warned residents to be vigilant, to be aware of their surroundings. But how do you protect yourself from a threat with no face, no motive, and no predictable target? The effect on the public was immediate and profound. A palpable fear descended upon the region. The mundane rituals of daily life were suddenly fraught with peril. People began to run in zigzags from their cars to the doors of grocery stores. Gas stations, the scene of 2 of the killings, became places of extreme anxiety. Some erected massive blue tarps around the pumps to shield their customers from a potential line of sight. Schools went into code blue lockdown, keeping children inside for recess and draping paper over classroom windows. Outdoor sporting events were canceled. The vibrant, bustling life of the suburbs slowed to a crawl, replaced by an atmosphere of hushed suspicion. An early and ultimately incorrect eyewitness account mentioned a white van or box truck fleeing one of the scenes. This single detail spawned a phantom menace. Suddenly, every white work vehicle was a potential sniper's nest. Thousands of tips flooded police hotlines, reporting sightings of suspicious white vans. The snipers had not just killed 6 people, they had taken millions hostage in their own homes and neighborhoods. The investigation, meanwhile, was a frantic scramble for any conceivable lead. A massive task force was assembled, a sprawling alphabet soup of law enforcement. The Montgomery County Police, the Maryland State Police, the Virginia State Police, the FBI, and the ATF. They set up a command center in a Montgomery County government building, a chaotic hub of ringing phones, tactical maps, and exhausted detectives. They were inundated with tips, over 100,000 by the end of the manhunt, most of them useless, born of public panic. The only solid evidence they had were the shell casings and the bullets recovered from the victims. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no clear sightings of a shooter. They were hunting a ghost. Profilers from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico worked to construct a psychological sketch of the killer. They theorized he was likely a white male, between 25 and 45, a disgruntled local with military or law enforcement training. They believed he possessed a high degree of woodsmanship, the ability to conceal himself in the brushy, wooded areas that often bordered the strip malls and gas stations he targeted. He was organized, meticulous, and likely felt a sense of powerlessness in his own life that he was now compensating for through these acts of remote, godlike violence. The profile was logical, based on decades of experience with serial killers. But in this case, it was almost entirely wrong. The killers were not a lone white man. They were 2 black men, 41-year-old John Allen Muhammad and his 17-year-old protege, Lee Boyd Malvo, and their vehicle wasn't a white box truck. It was a dark blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, a car so unremarkable it was functionally invisible. Inside this rolling Trojan horse, they had constructed a sniper's nest, a mobile platform for murder that allowed them to strike and then melt back into the river of anonymous traffic on the Beltway. As the first week of October wore on, the snipers expanded their hunting ground. On the afternoon of October 4th, 43-year-old Caroline Sewell was shot and wounded as she loaded packages into her minivan in the parking lot of another Michael's craft store, this time in Fredericksburg, Virginia. She survived, the bullet narrowly missing her vital organs. 3 days later, on October 7th, the violence returned to Maryland with an act of shocking cruelty. 13-year-old Oran Brown was being dropped off at Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie by his aunt. As he walked toward the school entrance, a shot rang out. The boy crumpled to the ground, critically wounded. His aunt rushed him to the hospital, a decision that likely saved his life. The shooting of a child on school grounds marked a shocking escalation. It was a violation of the most sacred of safe spaces, and it sent a wave of fresh horror and outrage across the country. But this time, the shooters made a mistake. They left something behind. Near the scene, in a wooded area where the shot was likely taken, investigators found a shell casing, and not far from it, a tarot card. It was the death card. On it was scrawled a chilling, taunting message, "Call me God." On the back it read, "For you, Mr. Police. Code, call me God. Do not release to the press." This was the first direct communication from the killers. It was a clue, a glimpse into their psychology. They weren't just killing, they were performing. They craved recognition, a perverse form of celebrity. The task force, desperate to engage, kept the message from the press as requested, hoping it would encourage the killers to communicate again. 2 days later, on October 9th, they struck again. 53-year-old Dean Harold Myers, a Vietnam veteran and civil engineer, was shot and killed while pumping gas at a Sunoco station in Manassas, Virginia. 2 days after that, on October 11th, 53-year-old Kenneth Bridges, a businessman and father of 6 from Philadelphia, met the same fate at a gas station in Fredericksburg. The pattern was clear: victims in vulnerable, open spaces, killed with a single, expertly placed shot from a distance. The terror was now regional, a creeping blight that respected no jurisdictional boundaries. Chief Moose, his face etched with exhaustion and frustration, became a nightly fixture on the news, pleading with the public for help, and at times speaking directly to the killer. "You have indicated that you want us to do and say certain things," he said at one press conference, referencing the tarot card. "You've given us a telephone number. We are waiting for you to call." The call never came, but another communication did. After the October 14th murder of 47-year-old FBI analyst Linda Franklin in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Falls Church, Virginia, police found another note in the woods nearby. Franklin had been shopping with her husband. The shot was fired from hundreds of yards away. This time, the communication was longer, a 3-page letter, protected in a plastic baggie and tacked to a tree. It was a rambling, menacing manifesto. The author claimed responsibility for the shootings and demanded $10 million to be delivered via a Bank of America credit card. "Your children are not safe anywhere, at any time," the letter threatened. It contained a postscript that would prove to be one of the most critical breakthroughs in the entire case, though investigators didn't know it yet. The author mentioned a prior unsolved crime, a robbery and murder at a liquor store in Montgomery. The investigators initially assumed this meant Montgomery County, Maryland, the epicenter of the attacks. They searched their records and found nothing that matched. The killers, it seemed, were toying with them, sending them on a wild goose chase while the body count continued to rise. The public's faith in the investigation began to waver. The killers were always one step ahead, seemingly able to strike at will, anywhere, anytime, before vanishing without a trace. The question on everyone's mind was no longer just who was doing this, but how. The answer to how was deceptively simple and ingeniously evil. It was a 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, painted a deep, forgettable blue, a car that had seen better days. It was a ghost car, one of thousands of unremarkable sedans plying the highways of the D.C. area every day. But this Caprice had been transformed. In the trunk, directly above the rear license plate, a small hole had been carved out, just large enough for the muzzle of a rifle to pass through. The back seats partitioned to the trunk could be folded down, allowing a person to lie prone, completely concealed from view. The shooter, typically the younger and smaller Lee Boyd Malvo, would lie in this cramped, dark space, aiming through the rifle scope out the tiny portal. The driver, John Allen Muhammad, would park the car, often in a carefully selected spot with a clear line of sight to the target area. A gas station pump, a store entrance. From the outside, it was just a parked car. No one would see a shooter. No one would see a rifle. There would only be the deafening crack of the shot, seemingly coming from nowhere, and then the Caprice would pull quietly back into traffic, another anonymous vehicle, disappearing into the flow. This single clever modification was the key to their reign of terror. It allowed them to operate with a brazenness that baffled investigators and terrified the public. In fact, on at least 10 separate occasions during the 3-week spree, police officers had contact with Muhammad and Malvo, pulling them over for traffic violations or questioning them because they were sleeping in the car, but each time they were let go. They didn't fit the profile. They weren't in a white box truck. To understand the why, however, we must look beyond the mechanics of the car and into the minds of the two men inside it. The partnership between John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo is a dark and complex study in manipulation, indoctrination, and the search for belonging. They were not equals. Muhammad was the architect, the ideologue, the master. Malvo was his instrument, the young, impressionable clay he molded into a ruthless killer. John Allen Williams was born in 1960 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He joined the Army in 1985 and served in the Gulf War as a combat engineer. He was an expert marksman with the M16 rifle, the military equivalent of the Bushmaster XM15 he would later use. By all accounts, his military career was unremarkable, though it ended with a reduction in rank and a less than honorable separation from active duty. After leaving the service, he changed his surname to Muhammad upon converting to the Nation of Islam. His life in the civilian world was a series of failures. He started a string of businesses, a karate school, a mobile auto mechanic service, that all eventually failed. His personal life was equally turbulent. His marriage to his first wife ended in divorce. With his second wife, Mildred, he had 3 children, but the relationship grew increasingly abusive and controlling. Mildred eventually left him, taking the children. This ignited a bitter and ultimately losing custody battle. It was this loss that seemed to be the catalyst for his final descent. He grew increasingly paranoid and resentful, developing a rambling, anti-government, anti-American ideology. He saw himself as a victim, a righteous man wronged by a corrupt system that had taken his children. In his warped worldview, American society was morally bankrupt. What he called the Matrix, he began to formulate a grandiose multi-phase plan to bring it to its knees. Phase 1 was the terror campaign in Washington, D.C. The goal was to shoot 6 people a day for 30 days, creating mass panic and chaos. This, he believed, would bring the city to a standstill. Phase 2 involved planting improvised explosive devices to kill police officers, and then extorting $10 million from the government. Phase 3 was the most chilling. He planned to use the extorted money to travel to Canada, find and recruit 140 disillusioned young black men and orphans, and establish a compound. There, he would train them to be a guerrilla army and unleash them on cities across the United States, launching a race war that would establish a new utopian society. The DC sniper attacks were not random acts of nihilistic violence in his mind. They were the first calculated steps in a revolution, a means to an end, and a twisted scheme he believed would somehow get his own children back. Into this vortex of resentment and delusion stepped Lee Boyd Malvo. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, Malvo had a nomadic and unstable childhood. Shuttled between relatives, often left on his own by his mother, Una James, who was struggling to make a living, he craved stability and a father figure. He found both when he and his mother moved to Antigua and met John Allen Muhammad. Muhammad, then operating his mechanic business, took an immediate liking to the bright but lonely teenager. He became the father Malvo never had. He bought him clothes, gave him attention, and, most importantly, provided him with a sense of purpose and structure. But this paternal affection was a poisoned gift. Muhammad began systematically isolating Malvo from his mother and everyone else, becoming the sole influence in his life. He illegally smuggled Malvo into the United States, bringing him to Tacoma, Washington. There, the indoctrination intensified. He fed the boy a steady diet of his extremist ideology, making him watch the movie The Matrix over and over, telling him it was a documentary about the oppressive white power structure. He trained him physically, putting him on a bizarre diet of honey and crackers and forcing him into an extreme exercise regimen. And he trained him to be a killer. He took Malvo into the woods and taught him to shoot, to move silently, to become a weapon. He essentially broke Malvo down and rebuilt him in his own image, transforming him from a lost boy into a loyal soldier, a sniper. Malvo came to call Muhammad father. He absorbed his worldview completely, believing in the righteousness of their mission. This was not just a partnership, it was a cult of two. Before they ever arrived in the D.C. area, the pair had embarked on a bloody test run across the country. In the months leading up to October 2002, they were linked to a string of robberies and shootings in states like Washington, Arizona, Louisiana, and Alabama. On September 21, 2002, they committed the murder of Kenia Cook and the wounding of Claudine Parker during a robbery of a liquor store in Montgomery, Alabama. This was the event that the snipers had alluded to in their extortion note. That note, with its cryptic postscript, Akitomazdi in one of the early shootings in Montgomery Journal, Call Me God, continued to baffle the task force. For days they chased the red herring of Montgomery County, Maryland. But the killers themselves provided the next clue in a series of phone calls to law enforcement, one placed by Malvo. They grew frustrated that their demands weren't being taken seriously. During one call to a Catholic priest, Malvo mentioned the Alabama shooting again. This information, relayed to the task force, was the key. An analyst at the FBI headquarters in Quantico suggested they widen the search. What if Montgomery referred not to the county, but to the city? Working this new theory, they ran a search for unsolved homicides in every city named Montgomery. They quickly found the Alabama case. The details were eerily similar. A single shot from a high-powered rifle, and crucially, a fingerprint had been recovered from a gun magazine dropped at the scene. The fingerprint was entered into the national database. On October 23rd, they got a hit. It belonged to a 17-year-old Jamaican immigrant named Lee Boyd Malvo, who had been processed by the Border Patrol in Washington state. The system also noted that Malvo had a known associate, a man who acted as his guardian, a 41-year-old Gulf War veteran named John Allen Muhammad. Suddenly, the phantom had a name and a face. Investigators scrambled to piece together everything they could on this pair. They discovered that Muhammad owned a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice with New Jersey license plate NDA21Z. The pieces were falling into place with astonishing speed. They learned that Muhammad and Malvo had spent time at a homeless shelter in Tacoma, Washington. FBI agents rushed to interview people there. One man, Robert Holmes, recalled Muhammad speaking with admiration about the D.C. snipers, saying it was a good way to get the kids back. This chilling comment confirmed the motive was tied to Muhammad's lost custody battle. The hunt was no longer for a generic white box truck. It was for a specific car and two specific individuals. On October 23rd, Chief Moose, his voice heavy with the importance of the moment, held another press conference. He announced that law enforcement was now searching for a blue Chevrolet Caprice with New Jersey plates. He named John Allen Muhammad as a person of interest. The nationwide dragnet was tightening. The tip that led to their capture didn't come from a law enforcement source, but from an alert citizen. Whitney Donahue, a former Marine, was driving a truck late on the night of October 23rd when he pulled into a rest stop off I-70 in Myersville, Maryland. He saw the car from the news reports, a dark blue Caprice, New Jersey plates. He called the police. Another trucker, Ron Lance, also spotted the car and used his rig to partially block the exit, preventing a potential escape. At approximately 3:19 a.m. on October 24th, heavily armed SWAT teams swarmed the vehicle. Inside, Muhammad and Malvo were asleep. They were arrested without a shot being fired. The 23-day reign of terror was over. Tucked away inside the Caprice, police found the weapon, a Bushmaster XM15 semi-automatic rifle, along with a scope, a tripod, and a wealth of other evidence. Ballistics tests would soon confirm it was the gun used in 11 of the 13 shootings in the D.C. area, as well as several others across the country. They also found a laptop with maps of schools and other locations, a chilling glimpse into their potential future targets. When news of the capture broke, a wave of collective relief washed over the Washington region. People honked their horns in celebration. Children were finally allowed to play outside again. The suffocating blanket of fear had finally been lifted. Now, the focus would shift from the manhunt to the courtroom, and the world would get a clearer picture of the twisted relationship that had fueled one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. The capture of John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo was the end of the violence, but it was the beginning of a complex and highly publicized legal battle. The question of where to try them became an immediate point of contention. The crimes had spanned multiple jurisdictions, including Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Federal prosecutors wanted to take the case, citing new anti-terrorism laws passed after 9/11. However, Attorney General John Ashcroft ultimately decided to allow the states to proceed first. The decision was made to try them in Virginia, a state with a strong death penalty statute and a reputation for swift justice, factors that prosecutors believed would provide the best chance for the ultimate punishment, particularly for the senior member of the duo, Muhammad. The trials were held separately. John Allen Muhammad's trial began in October 2003 in Virginia Beach, moved from Prince William County to ensure a fair jury pool. The prosecution, led by Prince William County Commonwealth's attorney Paul Ebert, laid out a meticulous case. They didn't need to prove Muhammad pulled the trigger in the specific murder of Dean Myers, the case they chose for trial. They proceeded under Virginia's anti-terrorism statute, arguing that Muhammad was the captain of a killing enterprise designed to terrorize the public. They used ballistics evidence to link the Bushmaster rifle found in the Caprice to the string of murders. They presented witness testimony from the various crime scenes and detailed the massive web of circumstantial evidence: the car, the laptop, the notes that placed Muhammad at the center of the conspiracy. But the trial took a bizarre turn when Muhammad, against the advice of his court-appointed attorneys, chose to represent himself. For 2 days, he stood before the jury, cross-examining witnesses and delivering his own opening statement. Muhammad, the man who had terrorized the region from the shadows, was now center stage, attempting to outwit seasoned prosecutors. His performance was rambling and often incoherent, and he was eventually persuaded to let his lawyers take over again. The defense argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial, and that the younger Malvo was the actual shooter, manipulated by others, but not by Muhammad. The jury was unconvinced. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, they found John Allen Muhammad guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. Lee Boyd Malvo's trial, held in Chesapeake, Virginia, presented a different legal strategy and a more complex psychological picture. His defense team, led by Craig Cooley and Michael Arif, did not dispute his involvement in the shootings. Instead, they pursued an insanity defense, arguing that Malvo was not criminally responsible for his actions because he had been completely and systematically brainwashed by Muhammad. They portrayed him as a victim himself, a lost and vulnerable boy who had been psychologically kidnapped and transformed into a child soldier. His lead attorney, Craig Cooley, argued that Malvo was a puppet in the hands of a master. Psychiatrists testified that Malvo was suffering from a dissociative disorder and that his identity had been subsumed by Muhammad's. They detailed the intense indoctrination process, the isolation, the militaristic training, the warped ideology that had stripped Malvo of his ability to make independent moral judgments. They painted a heartbreaking picture of a boy so desperate for a father's love that he was willing. The prosecution countered that while Muhammad was clearly the leader, Malvo was a willing and often enthusiastic participant. They presented evidence from Malvo's own interrogations, where he had at times bragged about the killings, drawing gruesome pictures of the crime scenes and referring to a headshot as a perfect lick. They played recordings of his interviews with detectives in which he coldly described the murders without any apparent remorse. The prosecution argued that indoctrination was not the same as insanity. Malvo knew right from wrong, they contended. He simply chose to do wrong out of a twisted sense of loyalty to his father figure. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense. They found Lee Boyd Malvo guilty of capital murder. However, likely swayed by his youth and the evidence of Muhammad's manipulation, they spared his life, recommending a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal saga did not end there. Muhammad was extradited to Maryland to face further charges, where he was also convicted and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without parole. He was returned to Virginia's death row. After exhausting his appeals, John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection on November 10, 2009. He offered no final words. Lee Boyd Malvo also faced trial in Maryland and received another 6 consecutive life sentences. In the years that followed, Malvo's case would become entangled in a national debate about juvenile justice. Following a 2012 Supreme Court ruling that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional, his sentences in Virginia were thrown into legal limbo. However, subsequent court rulings and a change in Virginia law have ensured that he will almost certainly spend the rest of his life behind bars. From prison, Malvo has given numerous interviews, expressing what appears to be genuine remorse for his actions. He has provided chillingly detailed insights into the planning and execution of the attacks, and the powerful psychological hold Muhammad had over him, a hold he describes as nearly absolute. The conclusion of the trials brought a sense of legal finality, but the emotional and psychological scars on the Washington, D.C. area lingered. The attacks had fundamentally altered the region's sense of security. They had demonstrated with terrifying clarity how vulnerable a modern, open society is to this kind of asymmetric warfare. It wasn't a foreign enemy with a complex plot. It was 2 men in an old car. Their tools were not bombs or hijacked planes, but a common rifle and a profound understanding of fear. This brings us back to the central theme of our inquiry, the anatomy of public terror. The Beltway sniper attacks were a masterclass in its application. First, they weaponized randomness. By targeting a diverse group of people engaged in the most ordinary of activities, they ensured that no one felt safe. The threat was ambient, untethered to any specific place or demographic. This unpredictability amplified the fear, as the human mind struggles to defend against a danger it cannot predict. Second, they exploited the illusion of visibility. In our hypervisual age, we expect to see threats coming. The snipers, concealed within their mobile bunker, were invisible. The violence was disconnected from its source, making it feel almost like an act of a malevolent god, reinforcing the message on their tarot card. The shot came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Finally, they attacked the infrastructure of daily life itself: gas stations, grocery store parking lots, school grounds. These are the nodes of our communities, the places where the mundane business of living is conducted. By turning these spaces into kill zones, Muhammad and Malvo poisoned the well of public trust and shattered the communal assumption of safety that allows society to function. The case of the DC snipers serves as a dark reminder that the most potent weapons of terror are not always the most sophisticated. In this instance, the core components were a disenfranchised man's bitter ideology, a lost boy's desperate search for a father, a reliable sedan, and a .223 caliber rifle. Blended together, they created a perfect storm of violence that brought a major American metropolitan area to its knees for 23 agonizing days. The true horror of their campaign was its simplicity, a terrifying blueprint for how easily the fabric of society can be unraveled. It proved that the architecture of our daily lives, built on a foundation of presumed safety, can be dismantled by the echo of a single, unseen rifle shot. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.